Hey guys, how you doing tonight? This is Mike McCormick, and I'm with Advanced Criminology here in Owings Mills. This is a continuing saga here in the RICO and corruption case against the 8 officers. What we did is we went back and we looked at a couple of things dealing with the procedures, basically on how easy was it for these officers, these 8 officers, to steal approximately $500,000 in overtime from the citizens of Baltimore. After we did our research, we came away with the practice rather than the policy seemed to be overlooked, and therefore it led to a series of things that typically go on with the prosecutor's office and the officers who actually come in to testify in court when they're off duty. So all of the overtime that they're accused of stealing, again, $500,000, was based upon being off-duty hours and having to come to court for those for cases that they built, those gun cases that subsequently half of them, if not more than half of them, will be thrown out probably this year or next year. So it was all for naught, actually. So I've entitled this particular video, when you see it, how easy stealing overtime was for these Baltimore officers. So to really go back and look, I'm going to give you 2 things. I'm going to give you my history, basically, when I worked undercover narcotics and we had to come in on our off days or when we're off duty to go to court. Well, I got a chance to look at this policy. It's policy number 1811. It deals with court administrative hearing and procedures. And even though I read it, it's a 15-page policy, and I did read it from cover to cover. One of the things that outlined in the back that I laughed at, I had to laugh at it because oftentimes we think of police departments as being technologically sound. But I will tell you, the overtime system in the city of Baltimore is probably unlike a lot of other systems that I've come across researching in the criminology world about how overtime is kind of accounted for and the policies and processes that are used in different jurisdictions around the country. And Baltimore is probably like down on the totem pole in terms of how automated their system is. Well, their system is not automated. It's actually a handwritten system still. And the reason I can vouch for that is because the same overtime court appearance form called number 216 is the exact same form that has not changed in over 27 years. That's the last time I signed an overtime form, was 20-some years ago. Here's the form. That's the form right there. You can see that. It says there, off-duty appearance form 216. Okay? So when I saw it, I had to chuckle. Because you would think, even in private business these days, nobody pretty much uses a time machine anymore to punch in and punch out. Everything's pretty much done by computer, and they give you an employee code. And you punch your employee code in when you come into work, and when you leave, you punch it out, and everything is based upon what goes into what you punch in, your hours in and out. And then the accounting department handles the rest, and you get paid every week or every 2 weeks on your job if you happen to be a job where there's no salary. So I found it interesting that they still use the same system. So because the system is antiquated, because there's no checks and balances, and because there's a close relationship between the prosecutor's office, the clerk's office, and the officers when they come in the courtroom, what you have is what they call tacit they're tacitly complicit in assisting officers with overtime. Now, their job, according to policy 1811, is to, when an officer comes in that courtroom, he's to present that particular overtime slip to the clerk. You know, clerk's not available, he gives it to the prosecutor. And they in turn vouch for the time that he got there to the time he left. Now, in some instances, the time clocks are in the clerk's office, and all the officer does is punch in, and then when his court case is over, he punches out. But the only way that is authorized is that there must be a signature at the bottom on the right-hand side of that form, 216. That's a handwritten signature. And it's either going to be the prosecutor or it's going to be the clerk's office who actually writes their name in there. Then the policy says that the officer is to attach his actual summons to that particular form 216 and then submit it to his unit for proper procedures to go through, I guess, through the police department's accounting department. Now, having said that, let's talk about how we got to this point with a racketeering and corruption charge of stealing over $500,000 from the citizens of Baltimore in overtime. So it goes like this. The 8 officers basically were stealing money, property, and drugs. Aside from what I just told you about the $500,000, that came to about $250,000. If you didn't know, haven't been keeping up. So between the money they took from people, the property they took from people's in their homes, and the drugs that they seized and kept and resold, all came to a cost of about $250,000. If you add the $500,000 stolen from overtime, this whole case turns out to be close to $750,000 of what you have that these officers were involved in stealing. $750,000. It's a lot of money. Now, the average officer in this gun unit, the lowest officer in terms of salary paid by the city was about $60-some thousand. Then you had a couple around $70,000, and your supervisors, the ones that were sergeants, they were close to making about $80,000. So when I broke it down, excuse me, when I broke it down, literally each officer made about $62,500 a year in overtime that the taxpayers were footing the bill for. And they did this illegally. And they were assisted by people who did not check behind them to ensure that those times were the exact times they were supposed to be in court. Now, the federal government says they weren't in court. You know why? Because they were following some of these guys, and they were able to learn other information through their own resources that a couple of these guys were on vacations when they said they were supposed to be in court. Some of them were down in resorts at Myrtle Beach, having a good old time down there. And you had a couple of them hanging out in casinos, blowing taxpayers' money. Okay? And a couple of them were just at home when their slips were being punched by other officers. Now, so if I'm at home and I don't show up for court, excuse me again, and I don't show up for court, how is my ticket being accounted for? How is my ticket able to go through the process when I never showed up at all, and yet I got a paycheck for it? If you read some of the charges and the indictments, you will see that the officers were laughing and joking about, well, how much are you making this month in overtime? Oh, I made $3,000 in overtime. One talks about he made, $4,000 in overtime. So it was a big joke. It was a big game. Actually, when you read it, it's sad when you actually read it. So, and if you didn't know, one of the officers was sergeant. This guy was actually on the department for 21 years. So you just don't become a thief in 21 years. You were stealing for quite some time. So when we talk about a 2-year indictment, because this is only, most people think it ran for longer than that. No, it was only a 2-year indictment. And look how much damage these officers did in 2 years. Most recently, it's been reported that a couple officers, and I think I told you this several videos ago, that I had gotten information from a couple folks that used to work for the police department. They now work in different units around the state. That a couple of those officers were seen stealing years prior to this indictment. And it just goes to show you how strong that blue wall of silence is, that these guys won't even tell on each other when they actually see stealing going on in front of their face. So it's sad, but true. One officer just blew my mind. This just to show you how deeply they were involved in the criminal element. One of the officers was accused and pled guilty to assisting a federal suspect under DEA indictment, assisting him to take off a GPS that they put on. DEA put the GPS on to follow this guy. And one of these same officers who was indicted, Baltimore officers, they were helping this guy get the GPS off. So, I mean, that tells you right there, you know, what type of guys what type of guys these were. The other thing we came up with is that we did the numbers in terms of, let's face it, you and I, on average, are probably making between $50,000 to $70,000 a year on our jobs. I hope you guys are. But just imagine how many hours you would have to work extra per week to get another $62,000 if you were making that. You would have to double your workload. So you would have to be working close to 80 hours a week for 52 weeks to come up with those kinds of crazy numbers. And so I say that because the prosecutor and the clerk's office, they actually are vouching, right? They're swearing, so to speak, that these officers attended court when they said they were going to attend court, and they left court when they said they left court, and yet they were still being paid, and some instances weren't even showing up. So it's kind of hard to convince me, and I hope it's hard to convince you, that if I'm a state's attorney and I'm familiar with officers for the past 2 years in the gun squad and a clerk, I'm familiar with these guys because they're in there every day, supposedly, and I know their faces. You know, how does slips get signed and passed through the system without somebody catching it, other than the federal government, who does a RICO investigation and finally, you know, sees that this is what's going on? How does that happen? And so these are the things that we look at here at Advanced Criminology, because some of those things aren't reported in the newspaper. They're not going behind the scenes, so to speak, to ask, well, how does this happen that people can just put a slips in for 62 some odd $1,000 a year? Half the time they're not even in court, and yet the very people who know these officers by face are vouching for their appearance. So there's a problem there. And I hope that this goes on further through investigation through the State's Attorney's Office in Baltimore. They have to clamp down on what's going on, because these officers just didn't make that money on their own. They basically had help. So I wanted to bring that to your attention this evening. And again, we have some other stuff we're working on right now. And I'll get back to you as soon as I can with some more detailed information on the case as the case develops. As always, stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe. We want to pick up some more subscribers on this channel here. And I'll see you next time I post. Thank you.